The winter wind carved against the mullioned windows of Ashworth Manor with a persistence that matched the cold within its walls, and Lady Eleanor stood in the drawing-room watching frost crystallize in delicate patterns across the glass, each geometric design a small prison of ice that reflected her own crystalline entrapment. 3 years she had lived within these grand stone walls, 3 years of walking through corridors so silent that her footsteps echoed like accusations, 3 years of dining in a hall meant for 40, where only 2 sat at opposite ends of mahogany that stretched between them like an ocean. The house was beautiful in its severity, all dark wood and darker portraits, heavy velvet curtains the color of dried blood, marble floors that held the chill of winter deep into spring, and Eleanor had tried, in those early months, to soften its edges with flowers from the garden, with books left strategically in the library, with her presence offered like a gift that was politely received and promptly set aside. Her husband, Duke Adrian Ashworth, moved through the estate like a ghost of military precision, his tall frame always correct in posture, his dark hair always perfectly arranged, his grey eyes always looking past her or through her but never quite at her, and she had learned the choreography of their marriage with the dedication of a dancer learning steps to a performance no one would ever applaud. They had been arranged, she and this cold stranger, their families pleased by the alliance between her father's parliamentary influence and the Duke's ancient title, and Eleanor had come to the marriage with the foolish romanticism of a girl raised on poetry, believing that affection might grow where duty had planted seeds. But Adrian had made it clear from their wedding night, when he had bowed formally at her chamber door and retreated to his own rooms, that whatever this marriage would be, it would not include the warmth of genuine companionship. She watched the snow begin to fall now, thick flakes that blurred the formal gardens she had cultivated alone, and in her hand she held a letter written in her own careful script, addressed to her brother Thomas at his estate in Derbyshire, a letter that represented both surrender and salvation. Asterisk, I cannot remain where I am not wanted. Asterisk, she had written. Asterisk, where courtesy has replaced connection and duty has devoured any possibility of love. Asterisk, the decision had not come suddenly, but had accumulated like the snow outside, flake by flake, cold moment by cold moment, until the weight of it could no longer be borne. Tomorrow she would leave Ashworth Manor, would leave the title of Duchess, would leave the man who had given her his name but nothing of himself, and as Eleanor pressed her palm against the frozen window, she felt something shift in her chest, not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of the will to seek it elsewhere. 3 years earlier, Eleanor had stood in St. Margaret's Chapel dressed in ivory silk and Brussels lace, her hands trembling slightly as they held a bouquet of white roses that her mother had insisted upon, and she had believed with the fervent conviction of her 20 years that affection might bloom where arrangement had planted seeds, that the stern-faced Duke who waited at the altar might soften once they were bound together in the eyes of God and society. Adrian had been magnificent in his formal attire, his military bearing evident in every line of his tall frame, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from the same marble as the chapel's columns, and when the vicar had pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian's lips had brushed her cheek with such careful brevity that Eleanor had felt the chill of it even then, though she had dismissed her unease as wedding nerves and bridal foolishness. The wedding breakfast had been a grand affair attended by half of London's aristocracy, everyone remarking on what an advantageous match it was, how the Duke's heroism in the peninsula had earned him the gratitude of the crown, how his estates were managed with legendary efficiency, how fortunate Eleanor was to have secured such a prize, and no one had seemed to notice that the groom spoke only when protocol demanded it, that his grey eyes remained distant even as he made the requisite toasts, that he held Eleanor's hand during their first dance, with the same impersonal courtesy one might show a diplomatic envoy. She had heard the stories. Of course, everyone had about Major Adrian Ashworth, who had led impossible charges, who had saved his regiment through tactical brilliance and personal courage, who had returned from war with medals and commendations, but without the easy manner he had supposedly possessed before, and Eleanor had imagined in her romantic heart that she might be the one to reach the man behind the medals, to warm the soldier back to life through patience and devotion. Their wedding night had shattered those illusions with brutal gentleness. Adrian had escorted her to the ducal chambers, had bowed over her hand with perfect formality, had said in a voice devoid of inflection that she should rest well, and had retreated to his own separate rooms before Eleanor could find words to call him back, leaving her alone in a bed meant for two, staring at the canopy above, while tears tracked silently down her temples into her carefully arranged hair. Now, standing once more at the frost-covered window with her letter of departure in hand, Eleanor carefully folded the paper and sealed it with wax, pressing her signet ring into the crimson pool with a finality that felt like closing a book she had tried desperately to finish but could read no longer. And she thought of that hopeful girl in ivory silk, with something between pity and sorrow, understanding now that some distances could not be bridged by devotion alone, that she had spent 3 years trying to reach a man who had made himself unreachable, and that tomorrow she would finally stop reaching. Morning arrived with the pale reluctance of winter sunlight, filtering through heavy clouds, and Eleanor descended the grand staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, as she had done every morning for 3 years. Her morning dress of dove grey, chosen with the same careful attention to propriety that governed every aspect of their choreographed existence, and she found Adrian already seated at the breakfast table in the smaller dining room, his dark head bent over correspondence that seemed to perpetually require his attention, his coffee cooling untouched at his elbow, while his grey eyes scanned reports from his steward, with the focused intensity he brought to everything, except his wife. She entered quietly, her footsteps muffled by Persian carpets, and offered the same soft greeting she always did. "Good morning, Your Grace," and he responded without looking up. "Good morning, Lady Eleanor," his voice carrying that same polite disinterest that had worn grooves into her heart over countless such exchanges, and she took her seat at the appropriate distance, not at the far end, as they did for formal dinners, but not beside him either, never beside him, while the footman poured her tea with the silent efficiency of a man well versed in serving a marriage conducted through intermediaries. They ate in the companionable silence of strangers, sharing a railway carriage, Adrian occasionally making notations on his papers, Eleanor carefully buttering her toast and pretending to read the newspaper that had been laid at her place, and the servants moved between them, like chess pieces, in a game where the players never quite engaged, passing messages, refilling cups, existing as the only real connection in a room where husband and wife sat within touching distance, yet might as well have been separated by continents. Eleanor's heart beat faster than usual this morning, knowing that this performance was nearing its final act, that tomorrow's breakfast would find her chair empty, and Adrian dining alone, as he seemed to prefer, and she felt the weight of her decision pressing against her chest, even as she maintained the serene expression that had become her armor against the loneliness of being married yet utterly alone. When she spoke, her voice remained steady despite the turmoil beneath. "I am planning to visit my brother in Derbyshire," she said, the lie of omission sitting bitter on her tongue because she did not say for how long or that she did not intend to return, and for just a moment so brief she might have imagined it. Adrian's hand paused over his teacup, his fingers going still against the delicate porcelain, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he reached for the cup and took a measured sip. "I hope you will find the journey pleasant," he said finally, his tone as neutral as if she had mentioned the weather, and Eleanor felt something crack further in her chest because even now, even when she was preparing to leave him, he could not muster enough interest to ask when she planned to depart or how long she intended to stay away, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she had made the right decision, that she could not spend the rest of her life seeking warmth from a man determined to remain frozen. Eleanor's chambers became a landscape of careful decisions as she moved through the afternoon light, selecting which pieces of her life deserved transport to a future that felt simultaneously liberating and devastating, and Martha, her lady's maid who had served her since before the wedding, folded chemises and petticoats with trembling hands, while tears tracked silently down her weathered cheeks, though she said nothing at first, understanding perhaps that some choices arrived not from caprice, but from the slow accumulation of unbearable silences. Each object Eleanor lifted carried the weight of memory here, the pearl earrings she had worn to their first dinner party as a married couple, where she had tried so earnestly to be a credit to him, to stand beside him with grace and intelligence, only to have him introduce her with flawless courtesy, before spending the entire evening discussing politics and military strategy with the gentleman, while she smiled until her cheeks ached among the ladies who pitied her with their eyes, even as they envied her title with their words. She wrapped the earrings in muslin and set them aside, uncertain whether she would take them or leave them as offerings to a life she was abandoning. The writing desk in the corner held evidence of 3 years of futile effort. Here were the carefully researched notes on crop rotation she had compiled, after overhearing Adrian mention concerns about the North Fields, notes she had left on his desk one morning, only to find them later, filed away with a brief note of thanks, but no discussion, no invitation to contribute further, in no acknowledgement that she might be a partner rather than an ornament. There were the menus she had planned with the cook, learning through careful inquiry what dishes Adrian preferred, what wines he favored, orchestrating meals that might please him even though he consumed them with the same distant politeness he brought to everything, never noticing or perhaps never caring that the venison was prepared exactly as he liked it, that the library now carried the particular blend of tea he requested only when visiting his club. Martha finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "My lady, perhaps if you spoke with his grace, if you told him what troubles you." But Eleanor shook her head gently, kindly, because Martha meant well but could not understand that she had tried speaking, had tried everything except the one thing she was doing now, which was leaving. She remembered the day 6 months into their marriage, when she had gathered her courage and gone to his study, had asked tentatively if he might join her for a walk in the gardens she was cultivating, and he had looked up from his endless papers with those grey eyes that seemed to see through her rather than at her, had said with perfect courtesy that he had much work to attend to, but hoped she would enjoy her walk, and she had retreated with her dignity intact, but her hope diminished, learning the lesson she should have absorbed on their wedding night, that the Duke wanted a wife in name only, a hostess for his table, and a figure on his arm when society required it, but not a companion, not a confidant, certainly not whatever foolish romantic notion she had harbored about love growing where duty had planted them. The silver-backed brush that had been her grandmother's went into the trunk, then came out again as Eleanor wavered, wondering whether taking it felt like theft from a house that had never truly become her home, and her resolve, which had felt so certain at breakfast, now trembled like candle flame in a draught, as she contemplated the finality of what she was doing, the acknowledgement that she had failed to make this marriage into anything more than a legal arrangement, though she knew with the part of her mind that remained rational that the failure was not hers alone, that one cannot build a bridge when the other shore refuses all moorings. Mrs. Brennan found Eleanor in the conservatory that afternoon, where the younger woman stood among the orchids she had coaxed into bloom over 3 patient years, her fingers trailing across petals with the tenderness of farewell, and the housekeeper who had served the Ashworth family for 30 years and possessed the particular wisdom that comes from observing lives, unfold in the spaces between what is said and what is meant, approached with the careful deliberation of someone bearing truths that might not be welcomed. "My lady," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I hope you will forgive an old woman's presumption, but I cannot let you leave without speaking." And Eleanor turned from the flowers with eyes that held too much weariness for someone barely 25, offering a sad smile that acknowledged the kindness, even as it prepared to refuse whatever comfort might be offered. "Mrs. Brennan continued despite the resignation in Eleanor's posture, "His Grace is not the man he appears to be, my lady. There are things you do not know, things he would never speak of himself, but which might help you understand." But Eleanor raised one hand in a gesture that was polite yet final, her voice carrying a brittleness that came from hope too often extended and too thoroughly disappointed. "Dear Mrs. Brennan, you have been nothing but kind to me these 3 years, and I know you mean well, but I have endured enough of understanding without being understood in return, enough of making allowances for a man who has made none for me, who has never once asked what I might need or want or feel," Eleanor said, and there was no anger in her words, only the terrible calm of someone who has reached the end of their capacity for patience. The housekeeper's eyes filled with a sorrow that suggested she saw both sides of a tragedy unfolding, but she nodded slowly, recognizing that some decisions arrive after so much quiet suffering that outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, have no right to question them, and she squeezed Eleanor's hand once before withdrawing, leaving the lady alone among her orchids to complete her farewells. That evening, after the household had retired and the great house settled into its nighttime silence, Eleanor sat at the delicate writing desk in her chambers and composed the note that would formalize what her packed trunks had already declared, her pen moving across the heavy paper with steady strokes that belied the trembling in her heart. "Your Grace," she wrote, unable even now to use his Christian name, "I am departing tomorrow for my brother's estate in Derbyshire, where I intend to remain indefinitely. I have been your wife in name for 3 years, but I find I can no longer be your wife in silence. I wish you well in all your endeavors, Eleanor." She sealed it with wax, pressed her signet ring into the crimson pool, and carried it through the darkened corridors to his study, where she placed it precisely in the center of his desk, where he would find it with the morning's correspondence. And then she walked through the sleeping house one final time and descended to the gardens through the conservatory doors, and moved like a ghost through the paths she had designed and planted, past the rose beds that would bloom magnificently in summer, though she would not see them, past the herb garden she had established near the kitchens, past the small fountain she had commissioned to bring the sound of water to the terrace. And she said goodbye to the only home she had tried to make from duty, realizing as the first tears came that she was not mourning the loss of Adrian's love, because she had never truly possessed it to lose, but rather mourning the death of her own hope, which had finally, mercifully, expired after 3 years of slow suffocation. Adrian Ashworth, 7th Duke of Ashworth, rose each morning at precisely 5:30, a habit formed during his military years when dawn brought either salvation or slaughter, and he moved through his ablutions with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned that routine could impose order on a mind that threatened always to fracture into chaos, the cold water shocking against his skin, a reminder that he was here, in his home, not back in the muddy trenches where men screamed and died, and where he had given orders that sent good men to their deaths because war demanded such calculations, and he had been so terribly efficient at making them. By 6 he was dressed in the severe dark clothing he favored, no ornamentation beyond what rank required, and he descended to his study where he remained until breakfast, reviewing estate accounts and correspondence with the same fierce attention to detail that had made him a decorated commander, though what he was really doing was constructing the armor of productivity that would carry him through another day of not touching his wife, not speaking to her beyond pleasantries, not allowing himself the devastating luxury of loving her the way every fiber of his being demanded, because he knew with the certainty of experience, that everything he touched he destroyed. He had noticed, of course he had noticed, every small thing Eleanor had done over 3 years of marriage, the way she had learned that he preferred his tea without sugar, how she had somehow discovered that he found the scent of lavender calming and had begun placing sachets in his study, the notes about crop rotation she had left on his desk that demonstrated a keen intelligence and genuine interest in the estate's welfare, notes he had treasured even as he filed them away with only brief thanks, because to discuss them with her, to invite her collaboration, would mean lowering the walls he had built so carefully, would mean spending time in her presence, and he did not trust himself in her presence because she was so lovely, so kind, so utterly everything good in the world, and he was a killer, a man who had once beaten another officer nearly to death in a rage born of too many losses and too little sleep, a man who woke screaming from nightmares where he drowned in blood, a man whose hands shook sometimes when he was alone, and who feared what those hands might do if he allowed passion of any kind to break through his control. So he had watched her from windows as she worked in her gardens, had stood in darkened doorways to catch glimpses of her reading in the library, had memorized the sound of her laughter when she spoke with the servants, because he could not, allow himself to be the cause of that laughter, and when he had entered his study that morning and found the note centered on his desk with her seal in crimson wax, when he had broken that seal with hands that suddenly trembled and read her words, "I can no longer be your wife in silence," something cracked in the careful architecture of his control, some fundamental support beam splintered, and Adrian sank into his chair with the letter clutched in his fist as the truth crashed over him, that protection had become prison, that in trying to save her from his darkness, he had created a different kind of suffering, that she was leaving. She was leaving, and he had done this, and had driven away the only light in his carefully ordered hell through the very distance he had maintained to keep her safe, and the irony would have been laughable if his chest had not felt like it was caving in, if he could have drawn breath past the panic that seized him, If the world had not suddenly narrowed to one impossible imperative, he could not let her go. Adrian sat motionless at his desk. For how long he could not say, the letter still gripped in his hand as though releasing it might make her departure more real, and his mind, that tactical instrument that had served him so well in war, that could calculate trajectories and assess threats and devise strategies under fire, now turned its merciless efficiency upon himself, cataloguing with brutal precision every moment he had chosen. Distance over connection, every time he had watched her from shadows instead of stepping into light. Every opportunity for tenderness he had deliberately destroyed because he had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that he was protecting her, when in truth he had been protecting only himself from the terrifying vulnerability of being known, of being loved, despite the darkness he carried. And the realization struck him with the force of artillery that Eleanor was not leaving because she did not care, but because she cared too much to continue offering her heart to a man who refused to accept it. And God, what had he done? The memories came unbidden, sharp as shrapnel that day in the Peninsular Campaign, when Lieutenant Morrison, barely 20 and eager to prove himself, had questioned Adrian's orders to advance across an exposed ridge, and Adrian, in his exhaustion and rage at too many losses, had struck the boy, had felt bones crack under his fist, and had kept hitting even as other officers pulled him away. And though Morrison had survived, and the advance had succeeded, and Adrian had been decorated rather than court-martialed because results mattered more than methods in wartime, he had seen the fear in his men's eyes afterward, had understood that something in him was broken, that the civilized veneer could crack, and what emerged was monstrous, and he had sworn then that he would never allow anyone close enough to suffer his violence, his darkness, his capacity for brutality, when control slipped. But watching Eleanor these 3 years had been its own exquisite torture, standing at his bedroom window as dawn broke and seeing her in the gardens below, her hair catching the morning light as she tended her roses, or glimpsing her in the library curled in the green chair near the window with a book, or hearing her voice drifting from the music room when she thought herself alone, and he had memorized every inflection, every gesture, had treasured the polite exchanges at breakfast like a miser hoarding gold, had collected her small kindnesses, the lavender sachets, the notes about estate matters, and the way she had learned, without being told, that he preferred the curtains in his study drawn against harsh afternoon sun, and had locked them away in his heart, even as he maintained the walls that kept her at a distance. And now she was leaving. Now his protection had become her prison, as surely as his fear had become his own. And the carriage, he could hear it now through the study window, the sound of wheels on gravel as it was brought round from the carriage house, the jingle of harnesses as horses were hitched. And time was running out. The sand was pouring through the glass, and he was frozen, paralyzed by 3 years of practiced restraint, even as everything in him screamed to move, to run, to stop her, because losing her to his own cowardice would be a far worse fate than any battlefield death, would be a slow dying of the soul, stretched across decades of regret. And Adrian stood on legs that felt uncertain, the letter falling from his nerveless fingers to scatter upon the desk, and he moved toward the door, knowing that he was about to shatter every careful rule he had constructed for his own governance, knowing that he was about to step unarmed into a battle far more terrifying than any he had faced in war, knowing that Eleanor might already be too wounded by his coldness to hear him, but knowing also that he would rather face her rejection honestly than live another day behind walls that had become his tomb. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall with her traveling cloak already fastened, her bonnet ribbons tied with hands that trembled only slightly because she had survived 3 years of polite abandonment, and she would survive this departure too, though the marble floor beneath her feet and the soaring ceiling above seemed to press down with the weight of all her failed hopes. All the mornings she had descended these stairs, hoping to find warmth and finding only duty, and Martha was weeping quietly as she handed over the final valise, while Mrs. Brennan watched with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between sorrow and anticipation, and the footman stood by the great doors ready to open them on her command, and Eleanor was gathering herself for that final word, that irrevocable instruction to proceed, when she heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Adrian at the landing above, still in his shirt-sleeves as though he had run from his study without thought to propriety, and their eyes met across the distance that had always existed between them, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The servants frozen in their positions, the very air waiting, and Adrian opened his mouth and closed it again, his composure that iron control she had learned to recognize as the only expression. He permitted himself fracturing visibly, a crack appearing in the marble facade, and when he finally spoke his voice was hoarse, raw, nothing like the measured tones she had heard at countless formal breakfasts, and he said simply, devastatingly, "Don't go." And Eleanor felt the words strike her chest like a physical blow, because in 3 years he had never allowed himself such naked emotion, had never permitted her to see behind the walls, and shock held her immobile, even as pain surged up to meet it, because these words she had longed to hear, dreamed of hearing, prayed to hear, came now when she had finally found the courage to leave, when she had finally accepted that the man she had married would never be more than a cold stranger who shared her name, and it was too little, too late, too cruel to offer her this glimpse of feeling when she had already committed herself to departure, and she shook her head, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and turned toward the doors, her hand lifting to signal the footman, and behind her she heard Adrian move, heard his footsteps rapid on the stairs, no longer measured or controlled but desperate, and his voice came again, louder now, breaking, "Eleanor, please, I'm begging you, don't go." And she stopped because he had never used her given name before, had always maintained the formal address that kept distance between them, and she turned back to see him, descending the grand staircase, with each step stripping away another layer of the Duke, until what remained was simply a man whose hands gripped the balustrade as though without its support he might fall, a man whose face showed such anguish that Eleanor felt her resolve waver even as her wounded heart screamed warnings, and she watched him come down step by step, watched his careful control crumble like a fortress under siege, watched 3 years of walls collapse with each footfall, and she stood frozen between the door that promised escape and the man who had finally let her see him breaking. Adrian reached the bottom of the stairs and stood before her in the entrance hall, with the marble expanse between them, feeling vast as an ocean, and the words came tumbling out in a torrent that 3 years of silence had dammed up, his voice rough and breaking as he said, "I know every flower you planted in the East Garden, the white roses first because you said they reminded you of your mother, then the lavender along the path because you loved the scent at twilight, and the peonies last spring, even though the gardener said the soil was wrong, and you proved him mistaken because they bloomed magnificently in June, and I watched from my study window every morning as you tended them. I watched you kneel in the dirt with your gloves discarded, and your face turned toward the sun, and I treasured those moments like a miser hoards gold, collected them against the cold I had created, and I know you rearranged the books in my study by topic rather than size because you thought I would find them more easily, and I do. I have. Every single day I have noticed and been grateful, and I know you had cook prepare roasted quail on Thursdays because you somehow learned it was my preference, though I never told you, and the curtains you had changed in the dining room, let in the morning light without the glare that pained my eyes, and 1,000 other kindnesses, Eleanor, 1,000 small acts of care that I accepted like a coward, while giving nothing in return except cold civility and the prison of my distance. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face because these were the acknowledgments she had craved, the proof that she had not been invisible, but they came wrapped in such pain, such evidence of waste, and her own anger surged up to meet his confession, hot and righteous after 3 years of swallowing hurt, and she heard herself say with a fury that surprised them both, "Then why, Adrian? Why did you leave me to suffer alone if you saw me, if you noticed? Why did you let me believe I was unwanted, that I was merely an obligation endured? Why did you make me feel like a ghost in my own home? Why did you let 3 years pass in silence when you could have spoken, when you could have let me in?" And her voice rose with each question, the rage of the abandoned finally finding voice, and Adrian flinched as though each word struck him physically, and he said, "Because I was afraid, because I am damaged, because I have darkness in me that I feared would destroy you, because in the war I became something monstrous, and I was so certain that keeping you at a distance was protection when it was only cowardice, only fear dressed up as nobility. And I have loved you, Eleanor. I have loved you from those first moments, when you smiled at me during our wedding breakfast, and I saw your kindness, your hope, and I knew I would poison it if I allowed myself close, so I watched from shadows and told myself I was keeping you safe when I was only keeping myself safe from the terror of being known, of being seen in all my brokenness and found wanting. And Eleanor stood shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed, fury and grief and longing tangled together, and she cried, "You had no right to make that choice for me, no right to decide what I could bear. I am not fragile china to be kept on a high shelf untouched. I am a woman who married you willing to share your burdens, who wanted partnership, not protection, who has spent 3 years offering you my heart, only to have it returned unopened. And now when I have finally found the strength to leave, you tell me this?" And the truth hung between them, raw and bleeding. 3 years of miscommunication and fear and love unexpressed, finally spoken aloud in the entrance hall, while the servants pretended not to hear, and the carriage waited outside, and Eleanor's heart broke and mended and broke again with each word exchanged. Eleanor wiped at her tears with shaking hands, and felt the anger still burning in her chest, righteous and necessary, and she looked at Adrian standing before her with his defenses finally stripped away, and said in a voice that trembled with barely controlled emotion, "I will not accept your fear as justification for my abandonment. Adrian, I will not let you dress up cowardice in noble clothing and expect me to be grateful for 3 years of loneliness. And I need to know, I need you to tell me truly, do you want me to stay because you genuinely desire a life with me, a true marriage, or is this panic, born of duty, of obligation, of a duke's distaste for failure and scandal?" And she saw him flinch at her words, but she pressed on because she had earned the right to demand truth, had paid for it in countless silent dinners and empty nights and mornings waking alone, and she said, "Because if this is merely your pride speaking, if you cannot offer me more than pretty words spoken in desperation, then I will walk through those doors and you will let me go, and we will both live with the consequences of your choices." And Adrian stood very still for a moment, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths, and then he moved toward her with steps that were tentative, careful, nothing like the confident stride of a duke, but rather the uncertain approach of a man who feared rejection, and he stopped an arm's length away, and his hands lifted slightly, as though he wanted to reach for her, but dared not presume permission, and his voice when he spoke was raw, stripped of all artifice, and he said, "I want you to stay because the thought of you leaving tears, something fundamental in my chest, because I have loved you in silence for 3 years, and the silence has been destroying me as surely as my distance has destroyed you. Because when I imagine my life without you, it is nothing but empty rooms and hollow days, because you are the light in this cold house, and I have been a fool living in shadows of my own making." And Eleanor searched his face and saw vulnerability there, genuine and unguarded, saw the man behind the Duke's mask for the first time, saw fear and hope and desperate longing written in the tension of his jaw and the pleading in his eyes, and his hands remained suspended between them, asking a question his lips did not voice, asking for permission to bridge the distance he had created. And Eleanor felt her resolve wavering because this was what she had wanted, had needed. This honesty, this emotional nakedness, but 3 years of hurt could not be erased by a single moment of truth, and yet she saw in his face something she had never seen before, a man willing to be broken open, willing to risk rejection, willing to stand before her stripped of armor and pride, and she realized that this vulnerability cost him dearly, that for someone who had built such formidable walls, their dismantling required a courage she had not credited him with possessing. And her anger remained, but it was joined now by something else, a tentative hope, a possibility that perhaps the marriage she had mourned might yet be born, and she stood at a crossroads between past pain and potential future, her hand still on her traveling cloak, the door behind her still offering escape, while before her stood a man finally willing to be seen. The carriage stood waiting in the circular drive beyond the entrance hall doors, the horses stamping restlessly in their traces, while the coachman sat patient on his bench, and Eleanor could see it through the tall windows, that symbol of escape she had planned so carefully, and her heart pulled in 2 directions with a force that felt as though it might tear her apart. Because 3 years of loneliness screamed at her to protect herself, to leave before hope could betray her again, while something newer and more fragile whispered that perhaps this moment of raw honesty was the beginning she had always wanted, And Adrian stood before her with his hands still suspended in that gesture of tentative reaching, and he said in a voice that held none of the Duke's command, but only a man's desperate plea, "I am not asking you to forget, Eleanor. I am not asking you to pretend the past 3 years did not happen, or that the pain I caused you is erased by confession. I am asking only for a chance to begin again, properly this time, to court you as I should have from the first, to build what we should have built. And I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know I have squandered the gift of your presence and your patience, but I am asking nonetheless for 1 month, just 1 month to prove to you that the man standing before you now is real, that this vulnerability is not performance but truth, that I can be the partner you deserved from the beginning." And Eleanor felt the tears still wet on her cheeks and her anger still burning, but joined now by a terrible yearning, and she heard herself say with a steadiness that surprised her, "If I stay, Adrian, if I dismiss that carriage, it will not be to return to what we were. It will not be to accept scraps of attention or polite distance dressed in kinder clothing. I will require honesty even when it is difficult. I will require your presence not as obligation, but as choice. I will require true partnership in all things, and at the first sign that you are retreating behind your walls again, I will leave and I will not return. Do you understand? I will not live half a marriage. I will not accept pieces of you when I deserve the whole." And she saw him nod, saw him swallow hard, saw his hands drop to his sides, and then rise again in a gesture of surrender and acceptance. And he said, "I understand, and I accept your terms, all of them, and I will fail sometimes, because I am learning to dismantle walls I have built for years. But I will not hide my failures. I will not retreat into silence when I stumble. I will come to you with my struggles instead of locking them away." And Eleanor stood in the crossroads of this moment, feeling the weight of decision, and then she reached up with deliberate slowness and began to unfasten her traveling cloak, and she saw hope flare in Adrian's eyes like a candle lit in darkness, and she let the heavy wool slide from her shoulders into her arms, and she turned to where Martha stood nearby with the other servants, all pretending to be occupied with tasks while listening with rapt attention, and Eleanor handed her the cloak and said quietly, "Please inform the coachman that he may return the carriage to the stable. I will not be requiring it today." And she heard the collective release of held breath from the household staff, saw Mrs. Brennan press a hand to her heart with undisguised satisfaction, watched Martha's face break into a tremulous smile, and when Eleanor turned back to Adrian, she saw him standing utterly still, as though afraid to move lest he break the spell, and she said with a firmness born of hard-won self-knowledge, "1 month, Adrian, you have 1 month to show me that this transformation is real." The first week unfolded with an awkwardness that was nonetheless precious for its genuineness, for when Eleanor descended to breakfast on the morning after dismissing her carriage, she found Adrian already seated at the table, but this time he rose when she entered, a small gesture that nevertheless marked a departure from 3 years of habit. And when she took her place, he did not immediately bury himself in correspondence, but instead asked with visible uncertainty how she had slept, and though the question was simple, it represented a bridge being built, plank by tentative plank, across the chasm that had separated them. And Eleanor answered honestly that she had slept poorly, troubled by hope and doubt in equal measure, and she watched surprise cross his face at her candor, before he nodded and said that he too had lain awake, wondering if he would prove capable of the transformation he had promised, and thus they began the delicate work of actually conversing, of sharing thoughts beyond weather and estate business. And though the exchanges were halting at first, punctuated by silences that felt less comfortable than charged with possibility, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest that might have been the dangerous bloom of hope. On the 3rd day, Adrian appeared at the morning room, where she sat with her embroidery, and asked with an almost boyish diffidence if she might walk with him in the gardens. And Eleanor set aside her work and took the arm he offered, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of fabric, and as they walked among the beds she had planted and tended alone for 3 years, he said in a voice touched with wonder that he had watched from his study window as she created this beauty, had seen her consult with the head gardener about roses, and had observed her sketching plans for the spring bulbs, and he named the varieties she had chosen, the daffodils and tulips and hyacinths, and Eleanor stopped walking and turned to stare at him because he knew He had been paying attention all along, even while maintaining his terrible distance, and she did not know whether to feel comforted or angry at this revelation that her solitary labors had in fact been witnessed, and Adrian met her gaze and said quietly that he knew it was poor consolation for his absence, but he wanted her to understand that she had never been as invisible to him as his behavior suggested, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, and said that knowing he had watched while refusing to join her was perhaps worse than thinking he had not cared at all. And Adrian's face tightened with pain, but he nodded and said he understood that he was learning the full cost of his choices, and they walked on in silence that was heavy with unspoken things. The evenings brought dinner conversations where Adrian made visible efforts to share the details of his day, the meetings with tenants and decisions about crop rotations, and more remarkably, he asked about her activities, her correspondence with friends, her thoughts on household matters, and when Eleanor offered an opinion about a dispute with a neighboring estate, he did not dismiss it, but considered her words with genuine attention, and later she learned he had acted on her suggestion, and this pattern repeated itself through the week, small gestures accumulating like drops of water slowly filling a vessel, a book left on her sitting room table with a note saying he had thought she might enjoy it, his appearance at afternoon tea, which had always before been her solitary ritual, his request for her opinion on a matter of estate finances which he had previously handled entirely alone, and Eleanor found herself caught between protective skepticism that warned her not to trust too quickly, and a cautious hope that observed each gesture and wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, the man she had glimpsed in the entrance hall was proving himself real. It was on the 8th evening of their tentative new beginning that Adrian appeared at the drawing-room door as Eleanor sat reading by the fire, and she saw immediately that something was different in his bearing, a heaviness that spoke of internal struggle. And when he asked quietly if he might join her, she set aside her book and gestured to the chair opposite hers, watching as he settled into it with visible tension in his shoulders, and for several minutes they sat in silence, broken only by the crackling of flames and the soft tick of the mantel clock, before Adrian said in a voice barely above a whisper that he thought perhaps she should know about the war, about what he had seen and done, about the reasons he had believed himself unfit for her gentleness. And Eleanor's heart quickened, because this was the locked door he had never opened, the sealed chamber of his past that had driven all his terrible choices, and she said simply that she was listening and watched as he stared into the fire and began to speak of things that clearly cost him greatly in the telling, of battles where he had commanded men to their deaths, of decisions made in the chaos of combat, where there were no good choices, only lesser evils, of the sounds that still woke him in the night, the screams of wounded horses and dying men, and the smell of gunpowder and blood that sometimes seemed to coat his throat, even years later, and his voice remained steady through most of it. But she saw his hands grip the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened, and he told her of one particular battle where he had lost control in the violence, had felt something dark and primal rise in him that terrified him even as it had kept him alive, and afterward, when the blood rage faded, he had looked at what his hands had done and felt himself monstrous, and he said that this was what he had feared bringing into her life, this capacity for violence, this darkness that lurked beneath the Duke's civilized exterior. And he finally turned from the fire to look at her and said that he had nightmares still, that he would wake certain that blood covered his hands, that he feared his own anger because he had seen what it could become when unleashed. And Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened, because this was genuine vulnerability, this was the truth he had locked away. And when he fell silent, she rose from her chair and crossed to kneel beside his, and she took his hands in hers, feeling them tremble slightly. And she said that she too had fears, that for 3 years she had lain awake wondering if she was somehow fundamentally unlovable, if there was some deficiency in her that made her husband unable to bear her presence, that she had questioned every aspect of herself, trying to understand what was wrong with her, that he could not even sit beside her at dinner, and she saw shock cross Adrian's face as he realized that his protection had felt to her like rejection, that his silence to shield her had instead convinced her of her own inadequacy, and he brought one hand up to cup her face with a gentleness that belied his fears of his own darkness, and she leaned into his touch and said that she did not need him to be perfect, did not need him to be without scars or struggles. She needed only his honesty, his presence, his willingness to let her stand beside him in the difficult places, and he drew her up and into his arms with a care that spoke of reverence. And they held each other before the fire, while the walls that had divided them continued their slow crumbling, brick by careful brick, and Eleanor felt his heartbeat against her cheek and thought that this mutual vulnerability and witnessed pain, this was perhaps the true beginning they had needed all along. The fragile progress of their new beginning shattered on the 12th night, when Eleanor woke to find Adrian's side of the bed empty, for they had begun sleeping in the same chamber, though they had not yet progressed beyond tentative embraces. And she rose and found him standing at the window of his study, still in his nightshirt, his hands braced against the frame and his breathing ragged, and she knew immediately that the nightmares had returned with their full force. And when she approached and touched his shoulder gently, he flinched away from her and said in a voice she barely recognized that she should return to her room, that she should not see him like this, and Eleanor felt ice crystallize in her chest, because this was the old Adrian speaking, the one who hid behind walls and pushed her away, and she said his name firmly. But he turned from her and moved to his desk and began shuffling papers with shaking hands, as though he might lose himself in estate business at 3 in the morning, and Eleanor felt anger rise hot and sudden within her, not the polite frustration of their marriage's first years, but genuine fury, and she crossed the room and placed her hand over his stilling, the frantic motion, and said that she would not accept this, would not allow him to retreat into silence and distance the moment difficulty arose, and Adrian said without looking at her that she did not understand, that the nightmare had been particularly vivid, that he had woken, convinced he had hurt her, and needed to see her breathing peacefully to know it was not real, and his voice broke slightly on the words, and he said he could not bear the thought of bringing his darkness into her presence, of tainting her with the violence that lived in his memories, and Eleanor's anger transformed into something more complex, fury and compassion braided together, and she said that he was doing it again, making decisions for her, choosing isolation over trust, and did he not see that his protection felt like rejection, that his silence was its own form of violence against the connection they were trying to build? And Adrian finally looked at her and she saw shame naked in his face, and he said he was trying, truly trying. But the old patterns were so deeply carved into him that fear could send him sliding back into them, and Eleanor took his face between her hands and said that she understood fear, that she had spent 3 years afraid that she was fundamentally unworthy of love, and that every day of his careful distance had confirmed her deepest terror, that there was something wrong with her that made her impossible to want, and she saw shock register in his expression as though this had never occurred to him, and she said that they had both been hiding, both been afraid, both been allowing their fears to write the story of their marriage, and if they were to have any chance at all they needed to choose differently, to choose honesty, even when it was difficult, to choose presence, even when instinct screamed to retreat, and she asked him if he could do that, if he could promise not to run when the darkness came but instead to let her stand with him in it. And Adrian pulled her close with a desperation that spoke of drowning men grasping for solid ground, and he said against her hair that he would try, that he wanted to be the man she deserved, and Eleanor said that she did not need him to be anything other than honest, that she could weather his nightmares and his fears if only he would share them rather than locking her out. And they stood together in the pre-dawn darkness of his study, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding that transformation was not a smooth path, but a journey requiring choice after choice after choice. And when Adrian finally led her back to their chamber, they lay facing each other in the darkness, and he told her of the nightmare in halting words, and she listened and held his hand and did not turn away. And this, she thought, was the true foundation they needed, not the absence of difficulty but the willingness to face it together. As autumn arrived with its tapestry of gold and crimson painting the estate grounds, the transformation between Eleanor and Adrian deepened in ways both profound and ordinary, for they had learned that intimacy was built not in grand gestures alone, but in the accumulation of small daily choices to be present with one another, and the household staff whispered among themselves about the miracle they were witnessing, how the Duke now sought his wife's company at breakfast and lingered over the meal, not buried in correspondence, but asking about her plans for the day and sharing his own. How Lady Eleanor's input was now requested on estate matters, from tenant concerns to harvest strategies, her opinions valued and genuinely considered rather than politely dismissed, and Mrs. Brennan would smile her knowing smile when she observed them walking the gardens together in the late afternoon light, Adrian's hand resting gently at Eleanor's back as she pointed out the chrysanthemums she had planted or discussed her hopes for the spring bulbs. And it was during one such walk that Adrian presented her with a slim volume of poetry, its leather binding soft with age, and he said with an endearing awkwardness that he had noticed her reading poetry in the drawing room and thought she might enjoy this collection. And Eleanor opened it to find his own handwriting in the margins, notes he had made years ago, and she realized he was sharing not just a book, but a piece of himself. And she looked up at him with such warmth that he colored slightly and said there was a particular poem he thought of often, and he turned to a page marked with a pressed flower and read aloud in his deep voice about love that grows in quietness and patience. And when he finished, he met her eyes and said that he wished to court her properly, as he should have done from the beginning, to learn her not through silent observation but through conversation and shared experience. And Eleanor felt her heart expand with a hope that was becoming less cautious with each passing day, and she reached for his hand and laced their fingers together and said that she would very much like that. And in the days that followed, Adrian proved true to his word, appearing at her door with flowers from the hothouse and invitations to ride through the estate lands, sitting beside her in the music room as she played the pianoforte, and turning pages for her with a tenderness that spoke of reverence, joining her for tea and actually talking, sharing his thoughts on books they both read, and asking her perspectives on matters of philosophy and politics. And one evening, as they sat before the fire in companionable silence, Eleanor felt Adrian's gaze upon her and turned to find him watching her with an expression of such unguarded affection that her breath caught, and he reached for her hand and drew her closer and asked with a hesitancy that touched her deeply if he might kiss her, and she answered by closing the distance between them, and their first kiss was tentative and gentle, a question and an answer, a promise and a beginning. And when they drew apart, Eleanor saw wonder in Adrian's eyes, as though he could scarcely believe she was real and willing and here, and the household noticed the change in their duke, how he smiled now, a true smile that reached his eyes and transformed his stern features into something approaching joy. And Mrs. Brennan remarked to the head butler that she had known all along that the Duke had hidden depths, that love had been there waiting beneath the ice for someone brave enough to stay through the thaw. The crisis arrived on a grey October morning, when word reached the estate that a fire had broken out in the tenant cottages on the western edge of the property, and Adrian received the news while at breakfast with Eleanor, and she saw the immediate transformation in his bearing. The military commander rising to the surface as he stood, and began issuing orders to the footmen with a precision and authority that spoke of battlefield decisions. And Eleanor watched as his jaw tightened and his eyes took on a hardness she had not seen since the early days of their marriage, and she recognized the walls beginning to reconstruct themselves brick by brick as he prepared to face crisis alone. But this time she would not allow it, and she rose and placed her hand on his arm and said that she would accompany him, and he turned to her with an expression of immediate refusal forming on his lips. But she met his gaze steadily and said that they were partners now, and she would not be left behind to wait and worry, and something in her tone must have reached him, because after a moment's hesitation he nodded curtly and ordered her horse saddled alongside his own, and they rode hard across the estate lands with several grooms following, the smell of smoke growing stronger as they approached, and Eleanor saw Adrian's hands grip his reins with white-knuckled force and knew he was fighting some internal battle. And when they arrived at the scene, the situation was dire. 3 cottages fully ablaze, and families huddled in the yard with their few rescued possessions, while men formed bucket chains from the well, and Adrian dismounted and immediately took command, organizing the effort with military efficiency, his voice carrying sharp and clear over the chaos. And Eleanor saw the tenant farmers respond to his authority instinctively, but she also saw the tremor in Adrian's hands when he thought no one was looking, saw the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, and she understood that the smoke and the shouting and the desperate urgency were dragging him back to battlefields he had tried to leave behind. And when he barked an order with more harshness than necessary and a young farmer flinched, Eleanor saw shame flash across Adrian's face and watched him begin to withdraw into himself, even as he continued directing the firefighting efforts, and she made her way to his side and took his hand firmly in hers, and said his name until he looked at her. And she saw war memories behind his eyes, saw him teetering on the edge of retreating into the cold Duke, who protected everyone by feeling nothing. And she squeezed his hand and said that she trusted him, that he was doing well, that his strength in this moment was saving lives and homes, and she stayed beside him as he continued to give orders, her presence a steady anchor. And when the fire was finally contained and the immediate danger passed, Adrian's composure cracked, and he turned away from the crowd, and Eleanor followed him behind one of the outbuildings, where he leaned against the stone wall with his eyes closed and his chest heaving, and he said in a voice rough with smoke and emotion that he had felt it rising in him. The cold distance, the instinct to shut down and command without feeling, and he had been terrified that he would revert completely to the man he had been. But Eleanor took his face in her soot-stained hands and said that he had not retreated, that he had remained present even while afraid, that he had led with both strength and humanity, and she told him that she had seen him pause to comfort the children and reassure the elderly woman who wept over her home, and had seen him thank each man by name when the danger passed. And these were not the actions of the cold Duke, but of the man he was becoming. And Adrian pulled her close and held her as though she alone kept him tethered to earth, and he said against her hair that he had thought her love required him to be whole and healed and perfect. But she pulled back to look at him and said that she did not love him despite his wounds but including them, that she needed only his honesty and his presence and his willingness to let her stand with him in both light and darkness. And in that moment, behind the smoke-damaged cottage with their clothes ruined and their faces streaked with ash, Adrian understood fully for the first time that he did not have to be perfect to be worthy of love, that Eleanor had chosen him not as he might someday become, but as he was in that very moment, wounded and afraid and trying, and the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbled into dust. Their wedding anniversary arrived on a crystalline November day, when frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, and the morning sun turned the estate grounds into a landscape of silver and gold, and Eleanor woke to find Adrian already dressed and standing by the window of their now shared bedchamber, for in recent weeks he had tentatively asked if she would permit him to sleep beside her, and she had agreed, and each night they lay together talking in the darkness until sleep claimed them, and she watched him now as he turned at the sound of her stirring, and came to sit on the edge of the bed with an expression that was both nervous and tender, and he took her hand and said that 3 years ago on this day he had stood beside her and spoken vows he had not truly understood, had promised himself to her while keeping every part of himself locked away, and he wished to mark this anniversary not as a celebration of that cold beginning, but as a commitment to the marriage they were building now. And he asked if she would do him the honor of renewing their vows in the estate chapel that evening, just the two of them with the chaplain as witness, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his request, at this man who had been so afraid of emotion, now offering her this gesture of deliberate choice, and she said yes with a voice thick with feeling, and Adrian brought her hand to his lips and said that there was something he wished to show her first, and he led her through the house to the drawing-room, where she stopped in the doorway with a gasp, for the room had been transformed into a gallery of memory and gratitude, and covering every surface were representations of all the small kindnesses she had bestowed. Over 3 years of lonely marriage, the books she had left in his study were displayed on a table with notes in Adrian's hand, explaining how each had comforted him on difficult nights. The pressed flowers from the arrangements she had placed throughout the house were mounted and labeled with the dates she had chosen them. There were sketches he had commissioned of the garden paths she had designed, and the improvements she had suggested for the tenant cottages. And in the center of the room stood an easel, holding a portrait he had commissioned in secret, painted from his memories of watching her, and it showed her in her garden with sunlight in her hair and her hands full of roses and an expression of quiet hope on her face, and Eleanor moved through the room, touching each item with trembling fingers, while Adrian followed, and explained in a voice rough with emotion that he had noticed every gesture, every kindness, every attempt she had made to reach him across the distance he had imposed, and he had treasured each one even as he had failed to acknowledge them, and he said that he wanted her to know that those 3 years had not been wasted, that her love had been working on him all along like water on stone, slowly wearing away his defenses until the day she tried to leave had cracked him open completely, and Eleanor turned to him with tears streaming down her face and said that this was the most beautiful gift anyone had ever given her, this proof that she had been seen even when she felt invisible. And that evening, as the sun set in shades of amber and rose, they stood together in the small chapel where they had been wed 3 years before. But this time, when Adrian took her hands, his own were steady, and when he spoke his vows, his voice was clear and certain, and he promised to honor her not with distance, but with presence, to trust her with his darkness as well as his light, to choose her every day for the rest of his life. And Eleanor spoke her own vows with equal conviction, promising to demand his honesty, to stand beside him in crisis and in peace, to build with him a marriage of true partnership. And when the chaplain pronounced them bound together, Adrian drew her close and kissed her with a tenderness that held 3 years of longing and a future of promise. And that night in their bedchamber, they came together at last as husband and wife, not through duty or arrangement, but through choice and desire and hard-won trust. And Eleanor finally knew the joy of being fully seen and wholly loved by the man she had married. And Adrian discovered that intimacy born of vulnerability was infinitely more profound than the cold control he had maintained for so long. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as they lay entwined, he whispered against her hair that she had saved him, and she corrected him gently and said that they had saved each other. Months later, when winter's grip had loosened and the first tentative shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth, Eleanor stood at her bedchamber window, watching Adrian in the gardens below as he consulted with the head gardener about the season's plantings, and she placed a hand on the subtle curve of her belly where their child grew, a secret she had confirmed only that morning and would share with him this evening. And the sight of her husband, bending to examine the soil with genuine interest in matters he once would have dismissed, as beneath his notice, filled her with a profound contentment that still occasionally surprised her in its intensity, for their transformation from strangers who shared a name to partners who shared everything had been so complete that sometimes she struggled to reconcile the warm, attentive man she now knew with the cold duke who had once barely acknowledged her presence, and the estate itself reflected their happiness in ways both subtle and obvious, for the servants moved through the halls with lighter steps and readier smiles. The rooms that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with conversation and laughter, and just last week Adrian had agreed to her suggestion that they host a spring ball, the first entertainment the estate had seen in years, and he had made this decision not out of duty, but from a genuine desire to share their joy with their neighbors and tenants. And Eleanor thought of how different this pregnancy would have been in the marriage they had once had, how she would have faced it alone in silent rooms, with a husband who offered polite congratulations before retreating to his study. And she knew with certainty that Adrian would be present for every moment of this journey, that he would sit with her through morning sickness and midnight cravings, that he would place his hands on her belly to feel their child move, and would speak to the baby in low tones about the world waiting beyond the womb. And this confidence in his devotion was perhaps the greatest gift of their hard-won intimacy. For she no longer feared his retreat into coldness, and had seen him tested by nightmares and memories, and witnessed him choose vulnerability over distance time and again. And just last month, when the anniversary of a particularly brutal battle had left him withdrawn and haunted, he had not hidden in his study but had come to her and asked her to simply sit with him, and they had spent the evening in companionable silence with her hand in his until the darkness passed. And she had marveled at this man, who had once believed himself too damaged for love, learning to accept comfort without shame. And now, as she watched him straighten from examining the garden beds and look up at her window as though he had felt her gaze, and the smile that transformed his face when their eyes met was open and unguarded and full of a tenderness that made her heart swell, she understood that their story was not one of a love that had conquered all obstacles through grand gestures alone, but rather a testament to the quiet courage required to dismantle walls brick by brick, to choose honesty over protection, presence over distance, and to build something true and lasting from the broken foundation of what had come before. The birth came on a June morning when roses bloomed in profusion throughout the gardens, and the air was thick with their perfume. And Eleanor had woken before dawn with the first pains, and Adrian had been beside her instantly, his hand finding hers in the darkness, and he had stayed through all the long hours that followed, never once leaving her side, despite the midwife's suggestions that he might prefer to wait elsewhere, as was customary for gentlemen. But he had refused with a firmness that brooked no argument, and Eleanor had drawn strength from his presence even through the worst of the pain, from the way he whispered encouragement and wiped her brow and never flinched from her grip, though she knew she must be crushing his fingers. And when at last their daughter emerged into the world, with a lusty cry that seemed to fill every corner of the birthing chamber, Eleanor watched through exhausted tears as the midwife placed the baby in Adrian's waiting arms, and the expression that transformed his face in that moment was one of such unguarded wonder and fierce tenderness that Eleanor knew she was witnessing the final dissolution of the walls that had once defined him. For this man who had spent years hiding every feeling now stood with tears streaming openly down his face as he gazed at the tiny life cradled against his chest. And he brought the baby to Eleanor and placed her gently in her arms and said in a voice rough with emotion that she was perfect, that they had created something perfect together. And Eleanor looked from their daughter's small face to Adrian's transformed one and thought of the cold stranger who had stood beside her at their wedding, the man who would have received news of a child's birth with a formal nod and a polite expression of satisfaction before retreating to his study. And she marveled at the distance they had traveled, at how nearly she had lost this, had almost left before the breaking that had made all of this possible. And in the days that followed, as they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, Eleanor witnessed Adrian's capacity for love and devotion bloom in ways that continued to astonish her, for he was present for every feeding and every cry, and learned to change nappies with the same focused attention he had once brought to military strategy, spent hours simply holding his daughter and talking to her about everything and nothing while Eleanor rested. And one night, when she woke to find him standing by the cradle with the baby in his arms and moonlight streaming through the window, she heard him whisper to their sleeping daughter that he would strive every day to be worthy of her and of her mother, that he would never hide from them behind walls of fear, that he would show her through his actions what it meant to love without reservation. And Eleanor's heart swelled with a love so profound it was almost painful, and she understood that their redemption was complete, not because the past had been erased or the pain forgotten, but because they had chosen each time and again to be brave enough to be vulnerable, to tear down defenses rather than hide behind them, to build a life and now a family on the foundation of hard-won trust and deliberate courage. And as Adrian returned their daughter to her cradle and came to bed beside Eleanor, drawing her into his arms with the easy tenderness that had become natural to them, she knew with absolute certainty that this was the life she had dreamed of in her lonely years, but more real and more precious because it had been earned through honesty and sacrifice and the choice to demand and offer nothing less than everything. 5 years after Eleanor had stood in the entrance hall with her bags packed and her heart breaking, the Ashworth estate had transformed into something unrecognizable from the cold mausoleum it had once been. For the halls now echoed with the laughter of children, their daughter Catherine, now 4 years old, and her younger brother Thomas just beginning to walk, and on this particular spring morning, Eleanor stood in the very garden where she had once walked alone, to say goodbye to a home that had never felt like hers. But now Adrian knelt beside her in the soil, their hands working together to plant a new rose bush, while their children played nearby under the watchful eye of their nursemaid, and the easy intimacy between them as they worked was evidence of how completely their foundation had been rebuilt, for Adrian reached across to brush a smudge of dirt from her cheek with a tenderness that had become as natural as breathing, and Eleanor caught his hand and kissed his palm in a gesture of affection that required no thought or artifice. And as Catherine ran over to demand her father's attention, and Adrian scooped her up with delight, spinning her until she shrieked with laughter, while Thomas toddled after them with determined steps, Eleanor thought of the cold stranger who had once inhabited her husband's body and marveled at the completeness of his transformation, though she knew it was not transformation so much as revelation, the uncovering of the man who had always existed beneath the protective walls of ice. And later that evening, when the children were asleep, and they sat together in the library where Adrian had once hidden from her, and his arm around her shoulders and her head resting on his chest, as they discussed the week's plans and the estate's business and the 100 small details that made up their shared life, Eleanor felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes, and Adrian, who had learned to read every nuance of her expressions, asked what troubled her. and she told him she was thinking of the woman she had been 5 years ago, desperate and lonely, and convinced she would never know true partnership, and how close she had come to leaving before everything changed. And Adrian tightened his arms around her and said quietly that he thought of it too, of how nearly he had lost everything through cowardice disguised as protection, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Eleanor said that she was grateful for the pain now, for it had taught them both what they truly wanted and given them the courage to fight for it. And she knew that their story would not have been possible without the breaking that had preceded the rebuilding. And Adrian kissed her temple and agreed, and as the fire burned low and the night settled around them, Eleanor understood that this peace, this joy, this love had been worth every moment of loneliness and every tear shed in empty rooms, for it was real and hard-won and infinitely precious. Dear listener, perhaps you find yourself in a marriage or a relationship where walls have been built brick by brick until you can no longer see the person on the other side, where protection has become prison and silence has replaced intimacy, and perhaps you wonder whether it is too late for transformation, whether the distance has grown too great to bridge, and I would tell you that change is possible, but only when both hearts choose courage over comfort, vulnerability over defense, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is to refuse to accept less than you deserve and to stand in the entrance hall with your bags packed and demand truth. For Eleanor's near departure was not a failure, but the catalyst that shattered the careful control that had been slowly suffocating them both. And Adrian's breaking was not weakness, but the strength to finally let himself be seen. And together they built something far more beautiful than what they had started with, because it was chosen rather than arranged, earned rather than assumed. And if you find yourself in a similar place of coldness and distance, know that you deserve warmth and presence and partnership, that you have the right to demand honesty and connection, and that walls can come down if both people are willing to do the hard work of dismantling them. And whether your story ends in redemption or departure, choose courage, choose truth, and never settle for a half-life lived in separate chambers when the possibility of true intimacy exists. And may you find the peace that comes from being fully known and fully loved, and may you rest well tonight in the knowledge that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to tear down their walls. For more stories of love, courage, and second chances, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below about the power of vulnerability in relationships.